Hello, this is Erica Swenson Elliott, and I want to thank all of you who have been watching my little YouTube video shorts for the past 2 years. I've really enjoyed making them. Today, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I am going to tell you the story about who Pete Snowich is or was, and you have been watching his story unfold through my World War II playlist of shorts for about his life. I'm going to read to you what I wrote. I'm working on Pete's book. Pete was my great uncle who was killed in World War II on November 28th, 1944. And I'm hoping to have his book come out on his 80th anniversary of his death in November. And happy birthday to Pete because September 11th is his birthday. So, to begin, in the late 1800s, Pete's parents, Stephen and Anna Olesnovich, emigrated from the Austro-Hungarian Empire to Pennsylvania. They were recruited by the burgeoning U.S. coal industry for Stephen to work as a coal miner. Stephen's daughter from his first marriage and their first son, Stephen, came with them. I'm going to show you a photo of the family later in 1939. I don't have a very good photo of the family at this time when they migrated. So here's Pete up here, and then this is Stephen, and then this is the first sister that came over when they emigrated. And then this is their mother. So this is like 30 years after, 40 years after. Stephen's daughter and their son, Stephen, came with them. So 1, 2, 3. They spoke Russian, Rusyn, or Rusin, an ancient tongue that was tied to the geography of the Carpathian Mountains. It is a borderland between East and West. And their village was along the edge of where Poland and the Ukraine meet today, where the Carpathian Mountains are. They owned a home in Houto, Pennsylvania, Hauto. It was in the heart of coal country, astride the world's mammoth vein of coal. Pete was their eighth and last child born on September 11th in 1906. While Anna was pregnant with Pete, his father was tragically killed in an accident where his neck was broken while he was hitching a ride on the back of a train through a tunnel, and he hit his head on something. Somehow, Anna and her tribe of 8 children, as well as her oldest stepdaughter, Mary up here, they survived on their own for 7 years. The oldest teenage son, Stephen, worked in the coal mines, and their mother, Anna, could also sew and make quilts for a little money. Their saving grace was the young widow owned their house, so she could also take in boarders or do laundry for the neighbors, creating a little cash too. Back in 1913, when Pete was only 7 years old, Anna married the next door neighbor, a Swedish immigrant. He was a cabinet maker and also widowed. His name was John Peter Swenson. So now you know where I got that name from. When Anna was 40 years old and Swenson was in his 60s, they gave birth to a son, John Oscar Swenson, this guy right here. He was born on the 4th of July, and he was their American boy. He was also Pete's little half-brother who melded these two very different immigrant families from different countries together. So Pete and all of his siblings grew up in a trilingual family. They spoke English, Russian, or they had like a kind of a pidgin, peasant, Slovak kind of language, so maybe not High Russian. And they also spoke Swedish, the grandfather. To start their newly combined life, the family moved up the steep mountain slope to 138 West Ridge Street in the town of Coaldale, Pennsylvania. The two towns were directly connected by a train tunnel for coal, and there was a switchback road to transport people that was actually a lot longer way to go all the way around the mountain. At some point during this time, the children, as they grew into adults, Americanized their last name. They went from Olisnovich to Snowich, Snoich. They had a little funny, like, mountain accent too, so how I remember the Snowich ancestors, they were like Snooich, Snooich. There, Pete and his siblings all grew up and graduated from Coaldale High School. And like his many brothers, Pete was a standout football player. So here's like the oldest, he was working. So then John and Wash were ahead of him, and Joe, they all played football for Coaldale High School. And then Pete, and then my grandfather, their little half brother was like the superstar for the little coal town, which was a huge football town. After Pete's graduation, he began working in the local coal mines for a few years to save up money for college. I'm going to switch over to college so you can see that. This is my website, ericaswensonelliott.com. And this is Pete's honor wall. So this is Pete's picture. He's in his early 20s because he had to work for a few years before he could afford to go to college. And then he ends up graduating from, it's now Kutztown University in upstate Pennsylvania. But at the time it was Kutztown Teachers State College. He's in this class photo as well. I forget where he is. Oh, right here in the front with his little hands and balled up in fists. He also played football for them and graduated with a teaching degree. There is a family story that he fell in love with a co-ed, but that there was family disapproval, probably over religious differences, because the coal mine, there was all kinds of immigrants from all kinds of countries. So like Roman Catholic, Greek Catholic, Protestant, Congregational, like everything. So they all had their own little churches. We now wonder who the girl was. There's a little reference in his Kutztown yearbook that he was always seen with a certain Titian blonde, which means strawberry blonde. We still haven't figured out who that is. I've been digging in the archives. During the Great Depression, Pete and 6 of his siblings, after graduation, Pete and 6 of his siblings moved about 100 miles south for work in the oil rigs and shipyards along the Delaware River. Let me come back to here. So John and his sister Rose went down there first, and this is her husband. So I think they were in the shipyards first, and then John. Wash stayed upstate. So, but they couldn't find any work. Joe came down. Pete, this is their sister Tess, and my grandfather. So they all like lived with each other and helped each other. They were still very close, and they helped to share expenses when they shared their house that they rented together. Pete had various jobs at the oil and shipyard companies. The brothers continued their sportsmanship at the local athletic club. They also belonged to a gun and fishing club up in the upstate, and they would go, I think it's Renovo is the town, and they could rent and have like a little cabin up there. And then this brother Joe would cook for them, whatever that, because he was an army cook, so he was the only one that knew. The girls weren't allowed, and then they would go up there for the weekend and do their shooting and fishing. And, eat what they caught. Per uncovered records, we also discovered that Pete went to San Francisco. He was looking for work with his teaching degree, and there was definitely a need for teachers out in San Francisco. He stayed with an aunt, his mom's younger sister. Her name was Amelia Nestori, and she lived in the Pacific Street. They called it Terrific Street. It's where all the bars and the dance halls were, and the exciting part of town. So Aunt Amelia's husband was one of the guys running the dance halls and the other different like boxing venues and things like that. So this sister, Sandra, who went by Sadie, she actually lived out there with the aunt for about 7 years. So Pete and Sadie were together for some time. However, we know he came back and he took the job at Sun Oil in about 1936. He had a brief stint as a math teacher at a nearby Nether Providence High School, but it might have been like an adjunct position because we don't see him in whatever the yearbooks and records that we found so far. According to his employer's newspaper, Sun Oil Company, during World War II, Pete was one of 17 Sun employee men that were killed. He had joined the company on July 10th, 1936, where he was working at the Marcus Hook refinery until June 20th, 1942, which is when he was drafted and joined the service. We know he worked mostly in the guards department, and in the company's bowling league, he also was on the bowling team for the guards department, and they would play each other in the like they would play the mechanics, which his older brother John was in. So we're coming up here. So this is right when he gets drafted in this picture, is what we think. Other records point to 1943 is when Pete was 36 years old. He was drafted into the U.S. Army for the, quote, war to end all wars, is what the government told them. After receiving training at Fort Knox in Kentucky, Pete was one of about 2,000 men that were organized into the 66th Armored Regiment, also nicknamed the Iron Knights. And that's what you see right here, this little shield. The Iron Knights, this regiment was part of the larger 2nd Armored Division, whose nickname was Hell on Wheels, you can see here. I've looked at the history of this badge and I now understand it. It's very much tied to General Patton and his World War I experiences in a town in southern France, and how General Patton at the time was, I think, a colonel, and he learned how to use the tanks that the French had. Like, we didn't even have any over there during World War I. And that's why they gave honor to the town. This is the town's little badge here, or shield, that they put within the shield of the Iron Knights. And the Iron Knights is a reference to tanks, the metal tanks, because they were migrating between the two wars from horses to iron horses, or the tanks. Pete wrote letters home describing how he learned to drive a tank and enjoyed the camaraderie with his fellow soldiers while at Fort Knox. By the time his division sailed for North Africa, he was first assigned to the headquarters of the regiment, supporting the officers. So in this regiment here, there's about 2,000 men. The headquarters, or HQ, was about 150 people, 120 men. And he was a private working for them. So we've kind of pieced together, and this is what's going into Pete's book that I'm working on and trying to turn it more into dialogue and a historical, like, narrative, is that probably because of his trilingual background and being in the coal mining town, there was like 8 to 12 languages spoken by about 3,000 or 5,000 people. So you heard everything. He would have probably been a very good linguist, and the family and him were very good at math. So they were all skills, I think, that would help him to be supportive of the officers. And also, he would have been their age too. So he was an old draftee, right? He's 36 and he's getting drafted as a private with like 18-year-olds. So he could be a lot of their dads or uncles at that point. It was when he was in North Africa, they first come to Casablanca, and then they end up in the Cork Forest for about 5 or 6 months, all in French Morocco along the Atlantic Ocean. So this is when FDR and Eisenhower, Churchill, Patton, they were having secret meetings of strategy there in Casablanca. And then This particular division was assigned to the Court Forest, which was a perimeter border between French and Spanish Morocco. And they were supposed to be defending that perimeter so that once we were now the Allies controlling French Morocco, Spain was supposedly neutral, and they didn't want to have the German Nazi forces to be able to come in over the Spanish Morocco border and attack, all of them that had just finally made their first amphibious landing. So that was about the first 6 months. Sometime during this period, Pete was transferred into the Reconnaissance Company, which was about 170 men strong. This company's role was fraught with danger, as they were the spear entering enemy's territory, often first to engage in combat, excuse me, enemy observation and interrogation. We now know, let me see if I can pull him. And this is Don Evans. We now know that one of his good friends was Private Don Evans, who also hailed from a nearby Pennsylvania town. The experiences of Pete's reconnaissance company are very well documented in Don Evans' memoir, Odyssey of an Iron Knight. Evans' recall of vivid detail is also reflected in Brad Pitt's World War II tank movie called The Fury. This film, Evans served as a technical advisor, as well as some of his comrades that also survived and served in the same company. Excuse me, I have allergies. This is Don's book back here, Odyssey of an Iron Knight. You can get copies online, used copies. It's not a continuous print on Amazon yet. Despite the company's significant amount of human loss throughout the war, Pete served for over 2 years alive. After the North African campaign, they crossed the Mediterranean into Sicily for further success in what was called Operation Husky. After that, and there's a lot of detail here, so that'll be in the book. This is just the summary. Subsequently, after Sicily, they arrived in the Salisbury Plain of England, where they joined the Allied forces at Tidworth Basin, the Tidworth Barracks, to prepare for Operation Overlord, which came to be known today as the D-Day. The infantry landed first on Normandy's beaches June 6th, and this year was the 80th anniversary of D-Day. But Pete's entire regiment had to hunker down in their landing ship transports, which were huge vessels, holding all of their tanks, also known as LSTs, and they were waiting for the order to disembark their heavy armored weapons of war. While waiting in the English Channel, one of the regiment's LSTs in their caravan hit a mine and killed hundreds of men on board, as well as destroying all their weaponry when it sunk. On June 9th, D-Day +3, the beaches were now sufficiently cleared by the infantry for the Second Armored to begin to unload onto the beaches their miles and miles of tanks and other instruments of war. Pete would never leave Europe. His recon company moved across Normandy, France, participating in brutal battles like Saint-Lô, then through Belgium, Holland, and finally into Germany. All along the way, they would sleep in dirt trenches they dug each night, which was more safe than sleeping in the metal tank. They wrapped themselves in blankets to ward off the bleak dampness. A few weeks before Pete's death, he had a few precious days leave where he experienced the beauty of a liberated Paris. Then he celebrated a cold last Thanksgiving with his comrades. A few days later, on November 28th, 1944, they were near Flossdorf in Germany. They had entered into the German plain of the Roer River, R-O-E-R, a never-ending sea of mud. A random mortar shell selected his life. To this day, it is not clear if it was friendly fire, which is what the family was told back at that time, or if it was an enemy mortar, the mortars would be fired from behind and then up to the front where he is. So it's probably much more likely that it was friendly fire from us, the Americans, that took his life. Pete had just finished a discussion with Don Evans, his fellow soldier, and they were both setting up for their machine guns for a perimeter defense for another long night watch. They wanted to make sure they were not in each other's lines of fire if something happened during the night. Pete and his crew left Evans Station to set up his own machine gun when the fatal mortar flew in. When it exploded, it knocked down Pete and his two men. Don ran to Pete and was by his side, finding the fatal wounds to the back of Pete's head. And in Don Evans' own words, if you listen to him on YouTube, where he has several videos up that he recorded at the end of his life, he said that he saw the entry wound on the back of Pete's head, and it was the size of a flashlight. He also said that he was the last one to speak to Pete. So Pete still might have been talking, even though he had suffered this mortal wound. And it is now known that he did not die until the next day. So if you look at the different military records, when he was evacuated to an evacuation hospital. Don ran to Pete and was by his side, finding those wounds. Pete died from these wounds while his two comrades survived. Eventually, Pete's body was interred at the American Cemetery of Margraten. We're going to look at that. This is Netherlands American Cemetery Memorial. If you're not familiar with findagrave.com, which I believe now is owned by Ancestry.com, but it's an independent tool. It's a great research tool. And this is the memorial that was created for Pete before I got connected with Find a Grave by some of the volunteers in Margraten that went and photographed every single of these soldiers' crosses. This cemetery, the American Cemetery in Margraten, Holland, was only a few miles away from where he was killed in Germany. Today it holds close to 12,000 American soldiers, as well as Walls of the Missing. The highest ranking officer in the cemetery is Major General Maurice Rose, who Pete was also under his command, especially in Sicily, and was parallel going into Germany with Rose. So Rose was not killed that much longer after Pete. The city of Margraten after World War II embraced the cemetery first by donating some of their premier farmland. Then they volunteered to help the U.S. Army dig the graves for the bodies of the fallen soldiers that were transported from many points along the war front. Even the town's children helped dig the graves, as it was becoming a matter of hygiene with so many cadavers and corpses lying about. One such child became one of the thousands of Dutch adopters of American soldiers' graves, a lifetime voluntary commitment. Pete's body remains in the Netherlands American Cemetery. His grave is carefully tended by his own adopter, Martin, who our family is very grateful for to this day. Pete is found in Plot F, row 11, grave 23. There is a memorial stone at his parents' graveside in Pennsylvania as well, and that's called a cenotaph at the St. John Baptist Byzantine Catholic Cemetery. You can see that here. So he just has this little plaque saying where he is actually buried. I like this picture. Let me see this picture. I really like that one. That's his dog Rip. He found, I think, in 1936, right when he got his job working in the oil companies before the war. Fallen, never forgotten. Rest in peace, Uncle Pete. We're glad we're being able I'm so grateful I've been able to piece your story together from the letters that you wrote to my grandparents and they wrote to you, as well as talking to your little niece, Marcia, who's now still alive today, who lived with you and remembers you as a little girl. Happy birthday on September 11th. We're working on your book. If anyone is interested in sharing information about their family member, particularly if you have someone that served in the reconnaissance company that Pete was in inside the Iron Knights, I would love to have a guest on the show do a little sharing of information so we remember these brave souls that gave us our personal freedoms that we still have today. So never forget. Thank you for listening. And now you know when I post my little shorts a little bit more about Pete's story. Happy birthday, Uncle Pete.